Okay, we'll make a start. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second in our Cultural Landscapes series of events for this academic year. I'm Dr. Penny Bradshaw and I'm an Associate Professor of English Literature here at the University of Cumbria. I'm also theme lead for Cultural Landscapes within the University's Centre for National Parks and Protected Areas. So just a little bit of very basic housekeeping from me before I introduce our speaker. First of all, can I ask that you don't type any comments into the chat box during the course of the talk itself, because the notifications can disrupt the talk, and we will have a window for Q&A at the end where I'll invite people to either put questions in the chat box or, if they prefer, to unmute and ask a question at that point. If you are having any technical problems with Teams, we're not able to offer individual technical support during the talk, so please visit the Microsoft Teams home support pages for guidance. And just to let you know that the talk is being recorded, but attendee cameras and microphones should be turned off, so only the face of the speaker and the slides will be visible on the recording. If you do leave your camera on, be aware that that will be captured on the recording. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for the evening, and it is my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jenny Messenger. Jenny is a writer and a researcher based in Carlisle. She received her PhD from the University of St Andrews in 2019. And in this, she explored the relationship between ancient philosophy and the work of Kathleen Raine and other 20th century writers. Jenny is currently writing a book for Bloomsbury about Kathleen Raine and the classics. The title of Jenny's talk this evening is Both Real and Imagined: Cumbrian Landscapes in Kathleen Raine's Autobiographies. I'm sure you'd like to join with me in offering a virtual welcome to Jenny, and so I will now hand you over to her. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'd just like to start by thanking Dr. Penny Bradshaw and the University of Cumbria for inviting me to come and give this talk. It's a real pleasure to be able to share some of my research on Kathleen Raine with you all, so thank you very much for listening. So, places are made up of shifting patterns of detail, both physical and mental. They exist as our memories. They are formed from the people we visited there, the things that happened, the books written about them, the art created there, the tragedies, joys, boredoms we experienced. We also know places geographically. We know that this street ends up at this park, that to turn here leads to a dead end. But often these aspects are far less real than our inner experiences are. The idea of place as having some essential quality, composed of the landscape, culture, and history of an area, that we can experience above and beyond the material surface, was intensely important for the subject of my talk today, Kathleen Raine. Raine had a long career as a poet throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. As well as publishing many volumes of poetry, she was also a scholar of W.B. Yeats and William Blake, and a writer on a range of subjects. Cumbria was particularly important to her. She spent time in Penrith with Janet Adam-Smith and Michael Roberts during the Second World War, and then lived in the vicarage at Martindale, near Ullswater. And she was also a guest of the art patron Helen Sutherland at her house, Cockley Moor, along with writers and artists like Norman Nicholson, David Jones, and Winifred Nicholson. So today I'm going to talk about Raine's books of autobiography, which are really rich works of intricate myth-making that constantly claim a deep relationship between art, place, and state of mind. For Raine, literature, nature, and consciousness were close bedfellows. Language had very real reference in a world of imagination, a shared place of collective understanding. And our internal thoughts and external surroundings were entwined, symbiotic, and capable of shaping one another. Within this worldview, Cumbria played a significant role as a place of inspiration and sanctuary. It was where she felt able to write poetry and experienced a sense of ancestral homecoming and friendship. These aspects created the landscapes of Cumbria for Raine. They were both real and imagined, which for her were one and the same thing. Published between 1973 and 1977, though drafted earlier, Raine's first 3 books of autobiography are works of spiritual life writing. Autobiography on Raine's Understanding was not an account of all the events that had happened in one's life. It was instead a process of enquiry, an interview carried out with the past by the present, or rather a way of interpreting the self as if it could be read, like a text. In the preface to her collected autobiographies, published in 1991 and shown on the slide, Raine claims that she wrote to understand her life, the most important element of which was the essential fable she had been fated to live. Autobiography is the genre most obviously committed to expressing first-person experience, and for Raine, lived experience was fundamental. In Farewell Happy Fields, the first book of autobiography, she wonders whether we each instinctively recognize, among the countless possibilities of fancy, the pattern of our own life. So rather than keeping to the temporal boundaries of birth and death, these patterns follow the shape of an ancient and innate narrative. She writes, "Some live their story early in life, others late, but when our time comes, we know our moment, enact our part well or ill as it is decreed in our deepest nature. We enact what we are." So for Raine, everyone had their own individual story to live, marked by their particular circumstances, which contributed to the overarching wholeness of common experience. Every life is a unique story, she states, while also asking, are we not all the numberless expressions of the one self? Raine believed in the immortality of the human soul, and that the life of the soul, otherwise known as consciousness or imagination or intellect, was the fundamental ground of reality. And this idea of individuality and collectivity is one of the central tenets of the Greco-Roman philosophical school of Neoplatonism. The idea of the many and the transcendent one, an overarching source of being that flooded through the whole of existence, in which all things are a manifestation of a single source of being. This idea was a significant influence for Raine. She also aligned herself with French autobiography, Rousseau, Proust, as well as Edwin Muir and Yeats, for whom autobiography was the literary form capable of marrying poetic detail with the narrative structure vital for placing a life within the mythic pattern of humanity. So, for example, in Muir's first autobiographical work, The Story and the Fable, which came out in 1940, he depicts, as Peter Butter writes, the story of one man enacting the fable of man, concentrating on aspects of life that best contributed to the fable. An Edenic childhood, the prominence of certain dreams, the significance of place, folklore, and imagination. And there's a lot, as we'll see, of this in Raine's work too. Cumbria was an important part of this central story that Raine worked up from her life. But how did she think of place, given her philosophical cast of mind? What made a place important to her? Her understanding depended on this central pattern with which she begins Farewell Happy Fields. This pattern traced being born into the world of generation, a soul into a body, living in a machine age. So she writes, I remember in the beginning a place of perfect happiness, filled with the bright sun of Easter, pure living light and warmth. My place was my state, and therefore in it I knew myself, where it was mine to be. So it always began, but I did leave that place, caught up, as it seemed, into a gentle drift as of existence unwinding itself, flowing out of the timeless state in which I still reposed as I floated along the peaceful river, past beautiful fields of flowers bathed in living light. This dream establishes the themes that characterize her autobiography. Her place is her state only in this eternal reality. In the world of time and matter, place and state are no longer united. The scene has the leisurely feel of a long afternoon in late springtime, with no distractions or interruptions, and a satisfying sense of harmony. But in this dream, existence is busy, as she puts it, unwinding itself. And after passing the idyllic, peaceful river and the beautiful fields of flowers, she is drawn irresistibly into the flux, unable to halt the process. So she writes, the sides of the stream grew steep and dark and dangerous. Oh no, oh no. What happened? Goodness. Sorry, I was just trying to move the thing. But there we go. Then rocky cliffs towered like great walls, and then these no longer resembled nature, but a modern city. Down the rapid current, I was plunged into a narrow passage, where the machines caught me at last among their rending wheels. At this point, I always awoke in terror. So Raine's, yes.
Jenny,
Hello.
sorry, it's Penny. Sorry to interrupt. So previously we could actually see the slide, but the slides have now gone completely.
No.
So when you were reading before, that was the correct slide up for us. So
okay.
Pull it back and then I'll give you a shout.
Let me see.
There.
There we go. Is that back?
It is now back. And
Thank
just
goodness.
to say to anyone who is still there with cameras on, you may want to turn your cameras off because it is being recorded. So there's a couple of people who've still got cameras on who we can see on the recording. So you might want to turn those off because I can't turn those off from the centre. Okay, yes, that is now definitely up and visible again.
I'm not going to touch it ever again. Okay. So yeah, so Raine's Blakean dream about being born into an industrialized urban society, her own dystopic vision of the mechanized 20th century, frames her life story as an ancient blueprint in which something free is trapped within a machine and drawn into servitude. She knows that the dream was her life, the pattern it would follow of necessity, by which she would plunge into terror from the freedom of being into the power of an irresistible mechanical destruction. So this dream sets the tone for the works to follow and shows that place is best understood in the context of her spiritual beliefs. Within Neoplatonic philosophy, the human soul would descend into a mortal body, where it forgot all the knowledge it had possessed when disincarnate, but it could be induced to remember aspects of its former life, given the right circumstances. Raine thus tells her autobiographical story as a journey of spiritual descent and moments of ascent that culminates famously in an intense love affair, her relationship with the naturalist writer and keeper of otters, Gavin Maxwell, whose book, The Ring of Bright Water, took its title from one of Raine's poems. This story has all the ingredients of the most compelling fairy tale or myth. It has visions, love, death, a vicious curse, more tragedy, loss of illusion, and then finally some kind of acceptance and reconciliation. And crucially, geographical places become the locations for her soul's journey. Before the story reaches its climax, though, there are several high points where Raine feels briefly in harmony with her surroundings. As the dream suggests, she is looking constantly for a place that agrees with her state of being, a site of beauty, where her poetic vocation could be fulfilled. Places have their identity as flowers or creatures have their soul, she writes. These places are often untamed, inviolate, to use her word, and she links poets with being able to preserve their inner wildness. So these are places like Cumbria, Northumberland, and perhaps more than anywhere else, Scotland. In Farewell Happy Fields, her childhood is characterized by the freedom that comes with place. So during the First World War, when Raine was a child, she moves to the manse in Great Barrington, a village in Northumberland, where her great-aunt Peggy was a school teacher. Raine found in the surrounding landscape and the ritualized traditions of agricultural life a freedom that corresponded, in retrospect, to what she felt was her true self. In Bavington were centuries-old traditions, ways of life that had grown in conjunction with the natural landscape. In this environment, she takes on some of its quality, adding to it the freedom of her childhood. Her place was her state, just as it had been in her dream. Were she to have written chronologically, though, she would have begun her autobiography in Ilford, the commuter town in Essex where she was born. In contrast to Bavington, Raine's Ilford is devoid of anything that might be good for the soul, and she views it as the stereotype of suburban life, lacking in culture, history, tradition, only concerned with superficialities. In her typically stark fashion, she describes being born among a people alienated and divorced from their cultural heritage, possessing only the shallowest of roots in the land and speaking a language impoverished by standardized terms and a lack of dialect words that underlined their severance from tradition. Unfortunately, her ticket out of Ilford led to yet another circle of hell, Cambridge at its analytic heights. So, describing her time at Girton College, Cambridge, which she spent soaking up ideas of communism, anarchism, and surrealism, she likens it to inhabiting the underworld of Dis. Raine equates these periods of her life with dimness and clarity in consciousness, connected to place understood as a nexus of nature, culture, and spiritual significance. The state of being she experiences in Ilford and Cambridge correspond to diminished states of consciousness, while experiences with certain works of art and literature, as well as particular people and strands of knowledge, bring about an expansion of her world. The contrast Raine sets up between these places, Bavington versus Ilford and Cambridge, feed her overarching myth-making. These oppositions serve the story, placing her work and life among a pantheon of writers, people like Yeats, Maud Gonne, and Edwin Muir. But she is also setting out her poetic philosophy here, the high standards by which she tried to make art and live, as well as her place within the esoteric branches of philosophy that she was drawn to. So in the book I'm writing, I focus much more on Greco-Roman philosophy and myth, and in particular the Neoplatonists, with whom she aligns herself very explicitly. And their account of the descent of the soul they take as being akin to the mythic heroes descending into the underworld, which is later a key device used by Jung, who was another influence for Raine. And this kind of knowledge is today often described as Western esotericism. Raine knew it as perennial philosophy, the idea that all the world's religions share central truths, including esoteric branches like Kabbalah, alchemy, Theosophy, Hermeticism, and Gnosticism, and extending all the way back to Pythagoras and Plato. And Raine too was interested in the East, so she was very interested in Indian philosophy. The fact that these areas of knowledge were shunned by the academy was also confirmation for Raine that this kind of learning was truly unquantifiable by conventional standards. She felt that poets and scholars had methods and approaches that were entirely opposed. Academics, she claimed, were influenced by materialist science, and this is what she finds in Cambridge. So they prized, she writes, detachment, dispassion, respect for objective facts, while poets, conversely, read with passion, with participation, valuing facts only insofar as they mediate truth of another kind. For Raine, there was a transcendent divine presence, and the world we could see was not the last word in reality. Knowledge was what is experienced for Raine, and reality is also what we experience. So she writes that within the scope of human experience, there are degrees of knowledge and value. with the beatitude of the vision of the holy being the highest term. So on this kind of view, everything we come into contact with, including people, landscapes, architecture, arts, and literature, they all create what we are capable of thinking and knowing. And her books of autobiography thus reveal a series of aesthetic and metaphysical awakenings that depict other ways of understanding and seeing the world, and other ways of being, many of which are linked to the places she inhabits. Now, Cumbria is depicted most fully in Farewell Happy Fields. In a chapter titled Rescue, which establishes the tone for her experience in the county, she is invited by Janet Adam Smith and Michael Roberts to stay with them at a house on Wordsworth Street in Penrith at the start of the Second World War. Now, she describes having long since felt as though she were in the wrong place, be it Ilford or Cambridge. Early on in Farewell Happy Fields, Raine had remarked on her sense of displacement and concluded that the feeling had never really disappeared. She writes, "The sense of living as an exile in a foreign land, of being of another race and kind from those among whom I have lived, has not weakened to this day." Part of the reason is the kinship she feels with her mother's ancestors, who were Scottish. So she recalls seeing the Cheviot Hills in the distance while she's living in Barrington, which she is told is Scotland, over the border. And so this land takes on a legendary quality. Displacement, she writes, was already my inheritance, but by so small a distance that I could still see the country to which we belonged. Coming to Cumbria, though, she gets the sense that she is returning. Describing her arrival in Penrith, Raine writes, "The transformation of my life began, not through my will, but through Janet's and Michael's kindness. On the night I stepped out of a dark train into the blackout of Penrith Station, with my 2 weary children. From the pitch-black night beyond the dim platform came the scent of wet fells and sheep, and the north, and I knew that after long exile I had come back to my own. The burden and the guilt of years seemed lifted from my heart by that breath from the hills of my childhood." So the intensity of this paragraph is, I think, paradigmatic of Raine's life writing. There is little middle ground in terms of feeling. Everything is either experienced as an extreme high or low. Anything less is not included at all. The familiar themes are here too. Exile gives way to a homecoming connected to her childhood. Place triggers a strong emotional response, or gives her permission to feel expiated. So the burden and the guilt of years seemed lifted from my heart. This homecoming is not physical, but spiritual. She is returning not to the place of her childhood, but to a landscape that shares in the essential quality of freedom found in Northumberland. Of course, it helped that this was the home of William and Dorothy Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the romantic writers of the imagination she loved and wrote about. And in relation to these writers, she feels the continued presence of history, like a palimpsest, noting that superimposed upon that older world was ours. As well as being a world of symbolic significance, wartime Cumbria was a domain of gramophones, frozen pipes, rationing, and terrifying roped-up walks across Striding Edge. While Roberts and Adam Smith were keen mountaineers, Raine would rather be forever in the places she loved, to sit hour after hour by waterfall or mossy rock. Not to visit, but to be eternally, at least for the moment eternally, at one with places remote from the human world. So her impulse was to be still, to be connected to her environment, to become as far as possible unified with it, rather than to stand in a relationship of subject and object with nature. And to an extent, I think this has become true. Lines from her poems Night in Martindale and On Leaving Ullswater for example, are inscribed on stones on the shores of Ullswater. And I think the latter poem in particular expresses her keen sense of embeddedness in and inseparability from the landscape and tradition of Cumbria. The lake is in my dream, the tree is in my blood, the past is in my bones. After Penrith, she moved to the vicarage at Martindale. Again, and perhaps even more so, this move is presented as a return to the world of the manse in Babington, a return to the kind of Edenic world she had inhabited before. Martindale here is Milton's Paradise Lost. Quotations from and references to the poem are found throughout her books. But it is also Greek tragedy and Platonic philosophy. Martindale was an internal present, and she writes that, "Into that now no Eumenides pursued me." This is also where she begins to see that there is a pattern in life, or rather that a life is such a pattern. Here, where her Aunt Peggy had had students, and close to where her mother was born. The connection is spiritual in terms of ancestral ghosts, and it is a tradition and a heritage that she feels part of. In her biography of Norman Nicholson, Kathleen Jones writes that Martindale is one of the Lake District's hidden treasures, a small hamlet in a concealed valley among some of the area's most beautiful scenery. And she also notes Raine's relationship with Nicholson, who provided the title of her first poetry collection, Stone and Flower, in his poem Above Ullswater, which Nicholson said was addressed to Raine, and in which, as Alan Beattie writes, he teases her gently about her different way of seeing the world. And this difference is very clear. Raine finds in her surroundings a continued experience of heightened reality, in contrast to Nicholson. She lived in, she writes, continuous delight. She was almost continuously aware of her daimon, and passing spirits of the elements came and went. So this is not a place that stops at the material, inhabited as it is by her Platonic daimon and various spirits. And it's not a landscape that could be reproduced for someone else, because the emphasis is on experience. It wasn't a perfect time by any means. She was also full of contradiction, feeling guilty for not being completely present for her two children, still in unrequited love with Alistair MacDonald, but she was capable nonetheless of writing poems that reflected, as she puts it, an illumination from a world or state which lies beyond, and above the egoism of guilt and sorrow. She describes her time at Martindale as being radiant with interior light, with the continuous interior illumination of moss and fern, of yellow Welsh poppies, and water flowing over stones reflecting the glitter of pure light. At Martindale, she also experienced an even more distinct alteration in consciousness, and this one was unlike her feelings of alienation or joy, prompted by place, but it was of a different kind altogether, and it's the only experience that she described in such terms. One night, she was sitting looking at a hyacinth in a vase on her table. And as she gazed, she found she was no longer looking at it, but actually was it. She writes, "I was not perceiving the flower, but living it. I was aware of the life of the plant as a slow flow or circulation of a vital current of liquid light of the utmost purity." She becomes convinced on this experience that everything is alive, just in different degrees, and she returns to normal consciousness with a sense of diminution. Writing about this passage, Greville Lindop draws a parallel with T.S. Eliot's experience of altered consciousness, and notes the tendency of mysticism in the secular age to be characterized in this way. Lindop writes that a powerful spiritual experience occurs to someone who has no particular framework of religious commitment, which can make sense of it, and then, in the absence of a religious commitment, They investigate by reading a great many books. And I think this kind of process of investigation is another story that's told in Raine's Autobiographies, which trace her gradual discovery of the perennial philosophy. And in this sense, her work can be read as documenting a kind of initiatory process. Raine follows Blake's golden string, which is also an image from Neoplatonism that implies the cosmic hierarchy and the transmission of knowledge. And she discovers, as she describes it, the tip of a submerged continent, leading to a vast expanse of learning that reverses the principles of materialism and cuts across disciplinary and chronological boundaries. And as here, she very often describes this process. So going to the British Library, carrying out research, finding out more and more links between people, texts, and places in terms of location. So countries, continents, lost lands. And all of this echoes the mystic philosophers like the 3rd century CE Neoplatonist Plotinus, who encouraged his listeners in his Enneads to fly to our dear country, to seek the Father, that is the soul's ultimate origin. So Raine's research is woven back into her life story, portrayed as a circular relationship rather than a linear line of influence. She maintained that she agreed with Plato and Plotinus, but that her initial insights came first, and her discovery of their philosophy second. So through Adam Smith and Roberts, Raine met Helen Sutherland, a patron of the arts who had moved from Northumberland to Cockley Moor at Matterdale. Going to stay at Sutherland's house meant Raine moved from the world of nature into the world of art. Both were capable of prompting creativity, but they were different in terms of the practicalities of living in the 21st century. So Raine writes that on entering Sutherland's clean, orderly home, she was lifted as by a tide above the mean struggle of poverty. This world of aristocratic inspiration and encouragement gave Raine the words to describe the natural landscapes she experienced so fully at Martindale. As she puts it, she acquires the tools to express what every hare in its form or curlew in its nest on the moor perhaps knows but does not know. And in The Lion's Mouth, her 3rd volume of autobiography, Raine experiences a vision similar to her experience with the hyacinth, and this comes soon after she meets Gavin Maxwell, whom again she associates with her ancestors, so both in Northumberland and Scotland. And in this vision, she sees a tree in the process of being dreamt into being by a sleeping boy who sits beside its trunk. And again, this vision seems more familiar, more recognizable than anything else in ordinary life. It prompts her to return to Cockley Moor to write again, years after her first visit. And in this house, art is taken seriously and given time to develop. Raine compares Sutherland to the astrological figure of Saturn, an embodiment of the wisdom of time and of all that matures slowly. And Cockley Moor comes to be a place where Raine wrote more poems on the white windowsill of her little guest room than in any other house save one. And indeed, it's where she writes this story of her life. So Raine portrays these two worlds in Cumbria as dreamlike. They possess a different quality in comparison to London. And in the next chapter, where she returns to wartime London to try and make her way as a poet among the literati, and also out of necessity to make some money working for the Ministry of Information. This chapter is titled Orpheus in Hell, and leaving Martindale is described as a mutilation. So the outer world always reflects the inner. No doubt London during the war was a kind of underworld in comparison with the lakes, but the hell Raine describes is internal. So, did Raine feel this way in Cumbria just because it was rural and wild, with such beautiful, dramatic landscapes? I think the answer is no. Not all natural landscapes were equated with the freedom of being, and instead she experienced nature as something that could be closed or open. Even the most theoretically beautiful places, linked just as deeply with myth and literature, were not guaranteed to provoke a similar response. So in The Lion's Mouth, she writes that it is not vegetation that makes Eden, nor the fall of water flowing, nor the rowan nor apple tree in bloom. It is the power of entering that invisible closed gate, which is everywhere and nowhere. And she adds that she has walked in flowery Italy, in Greece, in the virgin woods of America, and nowhere found that gate. So the places that meant most were the ones that could be enfolded into her central narrative of genealogy, in which ancestral bloodlines were a palpable part of place. Yet I think there was also perhaps something that appealed to her in meeting faceless ancestors who made no demands of her. Raine was clearly drawn to places like the Lake District, in part because there she could be nameless, identityless, where one could, as she puts it, ascend into hidden and untouched places, and there, invisible, anonymous, lay one's face close to the antiquity of moss and stone, and shed all that is human. Throughout the autobiographies, she refers to masks and shrouds of various kinds, which she takes up to conceal her real feelings, either to protect them or to survive the situation she finds herself in. So in The Land Unknown, which is the second work of autobiography, she describes a mask she acquires in Cambridge after eating the pomegranate seed of materialist philosophy and scientific criticism. She develops a thin, brittle new personality and was not at that time anyone or anything except the part, she claims. And this mask turns out to be difficult to shake. At the time of writing, she was still wearing it uneasily. She writes, "It fits remarkably ill the person who slips it off whenever solitude permits. Yet I cannot disown it. It is what I chose to make of myself at that time." She also notes that Martindale was an experience of solitude. Solitude, but not loneliness, for solitude is the most intensely experienced state. And that when her friends visited, she had to kind of come out from the intensity of her inner life. So the literary critic William Empson comes to see her, but she can't explain to him that she isn't the same person in Martindale as the one he knew in Cambridge. And this distinction becomes, in relation to William, untrue. So the real Kathleen needs freedom to exist, which comes in solitude, in nature, in Northumberland and Martindale, or in childhood, but fundamentally when connected to the world of imagination. This identity is, however, very easily obscured. Remembering an early memory of a pine wood that was near her grandfather's garden, she recalls her joy at experiencing the wood as another vista of awareness into which consciousness could flow. The pinewood's existence presents kind of more space for Raine's mind. The world perceived was that consciousness. That consciousness was the world. There was no distinction between seer and seen, knowledge and its object. All was mine because myself. So this is the original expression of consciousness, the unity between state and place that she's looking for. Subject and surroundings completely in harmony. This is what she's looking for throughout her autobiographies, and it's what she finds briefly in Cumbria. She is aware of the inevitability that this freedom will end. After that unity comes disjunction, and she notes that people inevitably turn away from their birthright, and our separate identity grows over us like a skin or a shroud. It's also worth mentioning, I think, that Raine was the object of various sorts of attention throughout her life. And this notion of constant shape-shifting and her desire to shed her mask or shroud entirely was, I think, due to the impulse to escape social constructs. In many ways, class is central to Raine's story. She develops her mask at Cambridge in part to deal with inhabiting a very different social world. So she was the daughter of a Methodist school teacher whose brothers were coal miners, and class consciousness and the difficulty of dealing with social mobility, they run throughout the autobiographies. Growing up, she inhabited different spheres, from the agricultural world of Bavington to the urban working and middle classes of Ilford. Each had their own sets of rules, and her account of what it was like to attend Cambridge, different again, very different, show the difficulties of social mobility and of reconciling one's different identities after social boundaries have been crossed. She went to grammar school, but notes that at that time, most of the Cambridge students were from the upper or upper middle classes. She feels, nonetheless, that she should be accepted. She writes, "I thought myself talented and beautiful." But then she comes to see slowly the upper class girls who all seem to know one another or have friends in common as being of another race, for whom no metamorphosis was demanded. She writes that she did not recognize in herself a social phenomenon, but invited to tea by one of these girls, she's embarrassed by the host, who observes it a pity that girls from secondary schools should be admitted to Girton. The girl apologizes, but the difference between them is underlined. Her decision to pursue a career as a poet was also something at odds with her class. She felt, for example, her father wanted her to be a school teacher. Her mother wanted her to be married and happy. Her Aunt Peggy thought she would have been better off without her Cambridge education. Her fear over losing her freedom and her poetic identity seems also to have been the fear of missing her shot at escaping what was usually expected of someone from her class. Scrubbing the floor at Martindale, she is reminded of her horror of the drudgery of housework. She writes, "My upbringing had strongly impressed on me the sense that there is some moral virtue attaching to the performance of menial tasks, whereas it is selfish to perform tasks not menial." And I think this is something I recognize from my own family history, the idea that intellectual tasks are a luxury of some kind for the working class. Describing William Empson and his sister-in-law, so comfortable in their social class, Raine envies their secure place in the social order, which she feels she lacks. In the wild places of Martindale, in the world of nature, there was no need to know the social codes or be judged on one's birthright. Identity can, in fact, dissolve completely. Describing a particularly difficult period in her life, Raine describes a fluidity of identity that ebbs and flows in intensity. "I find for myself," she writes, "that this sense of identity with past selves is by no means continuous. It is rather as if at times I was present in my life, at other times absent from it altogether, especially after childhood." She also asks, who in any case was Kathleen? I never quite felt that I answered to that name. Do we ever feel that we are really that person whose part we play? Are we not all nameless, boundless, something beyond our individual selves? Her name as a poet, she notes, may be her only enduring identity. So Raine's autobiographies turn the particulars of her life into universal myth, echoing the myth-making of high modernist writers, most particularly Eliot's Wasteland, which Raine greatly admired, as well as James Joyce's Ulysses. all of which use Greco-Roman and Christian myth as a framework within which to depict the 20th century. This mythopoetic vision is noted by Eliot in his review of Joyce's Ulysses, as he writes that Joyce has used the mythical method made possible by psychology, ethnology, and the Golden Bough, already used by Yeats. This mode, Eliot writes, is simply a way of controlling, of ordering, of giving a shape and a significance to the immense panorama of futility and anarchy which is contemporary history. And this mode came into being in the wake of, as Eliot notes, the works of scholars like J.G. Fraser with the Golden Bough, Jane Ellen Harrison, and Gilbert Murray. And all of these writers are name-checked by Raine. The mythic kind of mode was also taken up later by writers like Robert Graves, whose White Goddess unfolds a dizzying array of myths and literature into a grand narrative of poetic inspiration. Raine, though, applies this mode to autobiography, moving the framework of myth from the landscape of fiction and the sweeping comparative mythology of Graves to the task of self-inquiry, or rather self-preservation, of an inner life she felt she risked losing. She says she doesn't want to write a novel or a sort of fictionalized version of her life, because in her view, novels dealt with prosaic details. The mythic mode is a way of writing autobiography that creates poetic unity, but also emphasizes the fragmentation of identity and the needlessness of precise memory as events fade into the dimness of time. And this is somewhat similar to high modernists like Virginia Woolf in Moments of Being, but with a reversed perspective as to what reality actually was. Raine is blissfully unconcerned with chronology. She writes that chronology has little to do with recollection, which raises up wholes like separate poems, beautiful and complete. And this idea of recollection is drawn from Plato and the Neoplatonists again. The idea that it's possible to remember important knowledge from before the soul was embodied. The comparison to poetry, I think, suggests that she sees her process of writing autobiography to be working on the same sort of wavelength as poetic composition. So I think this is more than being inspired by a certain place. Raine experienced places at a level of being that went far deeper than superficial likes and dislikes, describing instead an ontological account. Raine's autobiographical writing rests on forms of knowledge that took the immortality of the soul and the existence of a divine presence seriously. As a literary project, she makes her case for being a poet whose vision was capable of being compared to Yeats. She elevates her story to the level of the universal. She weaves her life into a narrative that includes her forebears in the north of England and Scotland and places her in a continuum with them. She also mythologizes her generation of Cambridge undergraduates, putting them into the worlds created by the generation before them. So Virginia Woolf is enfolded into the mythic narrative when she comes to give a lecture on a room of one's own at Girton. The reception room at Girton is given a pervasive unreality. The college is described as a fairyland, and Woolf with Vita Sackville-West are the two most beautiful women Raine had ever seen. They arrived, she writes, as if they had descended like goddesses from Olympus, while Woolf has about her an inherited glory shed from the greatness of the writers of the past. The distance provided by autobiography and its factuality also enables her to write her peers into the wasteland itself. Raine's famous friends and acquaintances, so people like William Empson, Malcolm Lowry, Humphrey Jennings, Anthony Blunt, Jacob Bronowski, they are all found living in the wasteland, where she finds the spiritual state of Ilford given its enduring expression, as well as the territory of the rootless avant-garde. Their resulting fame also becomes something preordained. These students, she claims, recognized their involvement in the advancing frontiers of, she writes, not so much knowledge in the abstract as the consciousness of our generation. And this, in turn, she claims, is a natural process, repeated in Athens, Florence, Paris, wherever the good city may reappear. So, to conclude, Raine undoubtedly had and cultivated a very powerful vision of the world that could be intoxicating and inspiring, though she depicts herself as relatively self-aware of this. And she knew and respected many people for whom souls were fictional and for whom material reality was all there was. She could see the appeal of other worldviews, even being for a time a socialist, while married to the poet and sociologist Charles Madge, who co-founded the Mass Observation Project. But I think her conviction could also lead to overinterpretation, asking too much of other people, imagining their thoughts where in fact no knowledge was possible. In other ways, though, she was right. To an extent, thought does make the world. Raine presents her autobiographical project as a contribution to the general pool of knowledge about human life, but also perhaps as an exemplar of what the pursuit and representation of real life might involve, should someone be so inclined to live according to her values. Her time spent in the landscapes of Cumbria show her understanding of place as something emotionally and spiritually charged, uniquely experienced by each individual, in a world where thought and imagination have real power. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for that really interesting and illuminating talk. That was absolutely wonderful. Just while Jenny unshares her slides, I'm just going to turn to the audience. We have a few minutes for some audience questions. So I'm just going to double check the settings over here just to make sure that everyone can unmute if they want to. And ask a question that way. So you can either, if you've got a question, you can pop it into the chat box. If you can see that, you should have a menu which has various symbols, and there is a bubble symbol with some lines through it, and that is the chat box. So if you'd like to pop a question in there, I will fire that to Jenny. Or if you prefer, there's a little hand symbol and you can raise your hand and I'll then take questions in order. If you can't see any of those things, just unmute and I'll try and field the questions as best I can. So I think at the moment someone is just typing a question in for us. Oh, it was just a lovely thank you from one of our attendees, saying lots of connections to place and people to think on. So that's lovely. Thank you very much. So we've got a question from Liz Fisher. So Liz, if you want to unmute and ask your question, that would be great.
Yeah, hi Jenny, that was a great talk, thank you. I've always been fascinated by Kathleen Raine, so it was really filled in loads of gaps, and maybe it's a little cheeky of me to ask, but I'm really fascinated by the, I suppose, correspondences or differences between Raine's spirituality and Helen Sutherland's and Winifred Nicholson's. Because obviously Winifred Nicholson and Raine went on a lot of trips together. They travelled, and well, Winifred painted, Raine wrote, and there's some beautiful letters between the two which kind of try to unpack the differences between their beliefs. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, please.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously Helen Sutherland was a Catholic, and Raine sort of kind of wrestled with her inability to commit fully to Catholicism for most of her life, I think, or at least, I mean, up until the end of the autobiography, she's basically just still wrestling with her inability to commit. I think she talks a lot about whether eclecticism is a sort of acceptable line of kind of philosophical commitment to take. And so I think, yeah, I think her relationship with Helen probably, especially at the time that I was talking about in the 40s, where she did convert to Catholicism, I think Raine was especially susceptible to those ideas, and thought very deeply about them. And I think the good thing about Raine, as far as I know, is that she was sort of always willing to try and understand where other people were coming from to an extent. And as for Winifred Nicholson, so I don't know so much about her religious beliefs, so maybe you could tell me. I mean, I read the other day that she was a Christian Scientist. And actually, when I've been down at the British Library doing some research, and I was reading a journal entry from Raine, and it said something about, I think it was Winifred kind of suggesting that Doris Lessing take over a room and come live with Kathleen. And Kathleen is just like, no, no, because she's a Christian Scientist. No, definitely not. So yeah, that's clearly where her tolerance sort of had a limit. But yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yes. Well, yeah. Winifred was a Christian Scientist from the early 20s when both she and Ben Nicholson converted quite early on. And I think there's something, and Helen Sutherland, you know, she was a Quaker for a long time. She'd been brought up as a Methodist. She became Quaker for like 30 or 40 years before she turned to Catholicism. But actually, at the end of her life, she was really into high Anglicanism. So there's a real kind of moving around in terms of, you know, finding the best place for her sense of spirituality. And I think, you know, she's a really fascinating character because she's very open-minded in terms of her ideas about art and the avant-garde. But spirituality is absolutely key. And the way that she kind of approaches painting, it's as if she's talking about, well, Christian Science, it's about this underlying universal spiritual force, divine force. And the quotes that you were picking up from Raine suggested a similar idea, I suppose, similar principles. And I suppose it must have been fascinating to listen to the three of them talking at Sutherland's house, or, you know, to think about what they might have been discussing. I'm trying to remember the quote that is in my head about Winifred writing to Kathleen saying something about, I just want to understand why my angels aren't the same as your angels.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's hard to sort of to kind of divine the dividing lines between all of these different kind of systems or approaches to spirituality, when clearly, like, yeah, people did have very strong feelings. Raine clearly had very quite firm feelings about what she was and was not willing to accept in terms of spirituality. But then there is so much overlap, and yeah, I completely agree. It would have been very nice to sit in on those conversations. Yeah, if only. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.
That was a great question. And yeah, there's lots of sort of scenarios I envisage with Kathleen Raine in the Lakes, both at the Crockley Moor scenario, but also in the house at Penrith. And would love to have been a fly on the wall in some of those conversations. You get a wonderful sense of the kind of, you know, the sort of Coleridge, William Dorothy dynamic, that kind of sense of some really fascinating people sitting around having these conversations. So yeah, really interesting. Thank you.
Really?
Any other questions from our audience? I'm just got a hand there. Chloe, would you like to unmute?
Hi. I firstly thank you. That was fascinating and absorbing. I wanted to ask about sort of the Neoplatonic context. I'm thinking of the line where Plotinus refers to the ensouled body and he compares it to a maggot in the rotten bit of the tree, which is the soul of the all. So do we see Raine confront, grapple with, question that kind of ambiguity about the value of the body?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, and I think we do see her grapple with it quite significantly. Yeah, I think it's clear just throughout the autobiographies she's kind of torn between, especially when it comes to love, you know, like her whole thing with Gavin Maxwell is that she's kind of happy to put aside any sexual aspect of their relationship because it's a meeting of souls, you know, it's something that transcends bodily love, which is certainly an aspect of many religions and forms of spirituality, not just Neoplatonism. But I think, yeah, it's very interesting. I think what Raine takes from Plotinus is more the sense that sort of everything is alive, you know, everything, when she sees the hyacinth and she sort of feels its soul. I think that's what she gets more from Plotinus rather than the maggot example. I haven't read anything of hers that talks about that passage, but it would be interesting to know because it is quite an ambiguous part of the Enneads. But you know, elsewhere he seems to have some sort of reverence for the natural world. You know, all of his kind of spiritual exercises that call people to, you know, think of existence as a big planet, you know, kind of with life coursing through it. I think there is a tension in Plotinus about what he thinks about the body and its relationship with transcendence and kind of the role of nature, which I think Raine picks up on. But yeah, thank you. That was a very, very interesting question, and I think like, yeah, the maggot thing. It's a weird point, isn't it?
Thank you, Chloe. That was great. We are a little bit over time. We could maybe squeeze in one more very quick question if there is one, because I'm conscious I've only had opportunity for two there. So I'll just check the chat and check for raised hands. Just to see if there are any more audience questions, and there don't seem to be. So can I, on behalf of the audience, say a huge thank you to Jenny. I know that the audience would like to give you a round of applause, so you'll have to accept a virtual one for me, but that was really wonderful and really fascinating. So thank you very much, and thank you to the audience for joining us for this event. If you're not already on our mailing list and you'd like to be on the mailing list for Cultural Landscape events, you can just drop me an email at it's penelope.bradshaw@cumbria.ac.uk, and I will add you to our mailing list. And you can also follow us on Twitter at Cumbria English, and again our events are advertised on there. But for now, thank you to Jenny and thank you to our audience, and good evening.
Thank you so much.